Anyone visiting Colonial Williamsburg, whether you have a vast knowledge of its history or a much lesser understanding of its extraordinary backstory, will no doubt, first and probably foremost, have a keen interest in discovering the places the founding fathers of America spent time at while here amongst the many acres of land that make up the old colonial capital of Virginia. Through our 21st century eyes, we look out, gaze, and our minds are filled with curiosity and wonder. In the 18th century, a young George Washington must have felt the same way upon arriving at Williamsburg. He once entered into the city, just returning from a life-altering trip nearing the end of January in 1752, and upon his ship's return to Yorktown, he traveled into Williamsburg. Just as you and I would look out and see this place today, Washington's eyes would have steadily gazed at his surroundings as he entered the city, taking notice of the places around him, weighing his uncertainties, hopes, and expectations as he tried to conjure up the courage necessary to fulfill his reasons for being here. Just like you and I, having no idea where the future might lead him. One of the earliest connections George Washington had with Williamsburg was when he claimed his surveyor's license from the College of William and Mary at the age of 17. After the Revolution, he served as its first American chancellor, of which he held office from 1788 until his death in 1799. In 1752, his first recorded visit to Williamsburg involved an initial meeting with then Governor Dinwiddie that took place nearby the governor's palace. This meeting at the governor's temporary residence, the Carter Saunders House, happened during the short span of time the palace was under renovation. In 1753, after his first few initial visits to Williamsburg, Washington, who now held the rank of Major of the Southern District of Virginia, left the governor's palace after being awarded the role of leading a special envoy that Dinwiddie sought out. He was tasked to demand French forces vacate land claimed by the British along the Ohio River Valley. A recon mission and thorough report that eventually led to the French and Indian War. George Washington was friends with every royal governor of Virginia who resided here, from Dinwiddie to Lord Dunmore, who fled Williamsburg after the planned heist of gunpowder from the magazine ordeal. To many, including me, it's a mesmerizing thought to imagine George Washington spending time here at the palace in Williamsburg with its royal roster of governors and eventful happenings. After exquisite dinners and meetings with the dominant political figures of the colony and long days carrying out his daily objectives in Williamsburg, Washington headed over to one of his favorite lodging spots he would stay at frequently during one of his many recorded trips to Williamsburg, a place that lied nearby the Capitol building. Christiana Campbell's Tavern was Washington's recurrent lodging quarters during his trips to Williamsburg. He would pay Mrs. Campbell for board, which included money for his stay, as well as meals he would partake in at the tavern. Washington took a liking to the tavern seafood, which included early colonial Virginia dish options like scallops, oysters, crab, fish, and shrimp. His journals reveal a whopping 91 visits to Christiana Campbell's Tavern. He seemed to favor dining and staying here on a lot of his trips to Williamsburg. On May 3, 1769, he wrote in his journal, "Went into Williamsburg and dined with the council and spent the evening in the Daphne." The Daphne was a room in the Raleigh Tavern found on the Duke of Gloucester Street. The tavern was a popular place for socializing, business chatter, and political dealings. Important meetings and events took place inside the Raleigh Tavern's elegant rooms. While there during this visit in early May, Washington purchased subscriptions to 3 week-long purse races, which was a series of prize money horse races that took place twice a year in Williamsburg. He also logged time at the tavern's card table, playing cards for winnings, but also logged losses. During the span of time he visited Williamsburg, there was 43 recorded visits to the Raleigh Tavern. During the French and Indian War, Washington's name was submitted for a seat in the House of Burgesses, which held legislative sessions here at the Capitol building in Williamsburg, but he wasn't elected first time running. His chances for election victory must have seemed good, as he was already well known on both sides of the Atlantic due to his published account of his journey titled The Journal of Major George Washington, of which helped inform the British of the growing threat along the Ohio River Valley. Washington decided to run again later, and this time his campaign utilized an 18th century tactic that may have slightly helped secure the election in 1758. At the polls on Election Day, this time he treated voters to 46 gallons of beer, 35 gallons of wine, 2 gallons of hard cider, 3.5 pints of brandy, 40 gallons, 1 hogshead, 1 barrel, and 10 bowls of rum punch. Here at the Capitol, the House of Burgesses Journal stated a Burgess once stood up and exclaimed, "George Washington, Esquire, for his faithful services to His Majesty and this colony, and for his brave and steady behavior from the first encroachments and hostilities of the French and their Indians, to his resignation after the happy reduction of Fort Duquesne." He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses for 15 years before the American Revolution. George Washington was also known to visit one of the more well-known and popular 88 original structures still standing in Colonial Williamsburg today. The home of the Speaker of the House of Burgesses, the Peyton Randolph House. The house, built in 1715 and purchased by Sir John Randolph in 1724, was passed down the family and hosted George Washington as well as other notable historical figures. In May 1774, he wrote in his journal, "Came to Williamsburg with Mrs. Washington, dined at the attorney's, and spent the evening there." Dining at the Randolph home, George and Martha Washington, along with Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and others, cooked up a resolution that called for a day of prayer and fasting to be observed on the very same day the British Navy had planned to block Boston's harbor as a punishment for the Tea Party. There's record of Washington visiting the Peyton Randolph house 23 times. Weatherburn's Tavern sits across the street from the Raleigh Tavern and has a long history underneath its roof, spanning across the lifetime of its original owner, Henry Weatherburn. Weatherburn's Tavern was rented out to other keepers after the passing of its original owners, and often taverns went by the name of their keepers. In his journal, Washington wrote, "Dined at Anderson's, spent the evening there." In this case, Washington was referring to Robert Anderson, who took over Weatherburn's in March of 1771. His visits here included meetings to discuss land deals, amongst his other reasons to drop into Weatherburn's. It was quite well known for its high quality of service, food, fine china, silver, and glassware. It had an excellent reputation for social gatherings amongst the more elite members of the city. Just this short walk up from Weatherburn's, and also across the street from the Raleigh, stood another popular tavern in Williamsburg, one that is full of history and its fair share of mysterious happenings later in time until the present. Before the Revolution, Washington was known to visit King's Arms Tavern with his wife, as well as with friends, including fellow Burgess member Thomas Jefferson. They were known to enjoy pints of ale there together while debating and detailing the idea of independence. Within tavern keeper Jane Vogue's place of business that mostly catered to the respectable colonists that roamed Williamsburg. In his journal from November of 1772, writing, "Dined at the Speaker's and supped at Mrs. Vogue's." And a later entry that month stated, "Went to Williamsburg with Mrs. Washington, Mr. and Mrs. Custis, lodged at Mrs. Ambler's, also dined there, spent the evening at Mrs. Vogue's." Another place George Washington had recorded visits in his journals was Charltons, coined early by its owner as a coffee house and a tavern. Washington wrote, "Dined at Mr. Charlton's and spent the evening in my room." And another entry stated, "Dined with Miss Dawson and supped at Charlton's." The exact location of the coffee house is not known, but was noted to be nigh the Capitol, and another place George Washington had been to during his visits to Williamsburg. On numerous occasions, his Sunday attendance at Bruton Parish Church was documented within his journals. Went to church in the fore and afternoon, dined at Mrs. Dawson's, and spent the evening at my lodgings. And another on May of 1778 saying, "Went to church and returned to dinner." Bruton Parish Church has been restored to its colonial era, and George Washington's nameplate is found on one of its first box pews, along with other founding fathers. Set behind Bruton Parish, right off the Palace Green, was the George Withhouse. This house was where George Washington set up his headquarters prior to the siege of Yorktown, which ultimately led to the Treaty of Paris of 1783, officially ending the American Revolutionary War. Colonel Butler from a Pennsylvania regiment wrote about the arrival of George Washington and a large dinner party that had taken place upon his arrival to the Withhouse on the evening of 1781. The home would have been full of aides and generals of Washington, as well as Washington's personal assistant, Billy Lee. The Withhouse during that time would have had to have been outfitted with additional bedding, equipment, and furnishings to accommodate everyone that was part of the Washington entourage. Washington was known to have used the Withhouse for 2 weeks as his headquarters prior to the siege of Yorktown. Williamsburg was a place George Washington visited many times throughout his lifetime. Truly a place he grew to love. Journaling interactions, activities, meals, meetings, weather, overnight stays, and many of the legislative sessions and military endeavors that would help advance the country's mission of retaining complete independence from British rule, and eventually earning him the title as the Father of the Nation. Although the locations mentioned throughout this video are not a complete list of places the first President of the United States had visited during his times in Colonial Williamsburg, it would probably be safe to assume that just about anywhere you find yourself here, among the historic grounds that make up this old city, you could very well be standing on or trekking over the exact plot of earth that lies right there beneath your feet that George Washington himself stood on or traveled over during his time spent in Williamsburg.